Ronald Myers was not a man who enjoyed the spotlight, nor did he seek the approval of others. At 52, he had built his life and his business on a foundation of discipline, innovation, and quiet determination. His agri-tech company, GreenCor Systems, was his crowning achievement. Specializing in advanced vertical farming and water-efficient irrigation systems, GreenCor was more than just a business, it was his legacy, proof that he could combine cutting-edge technology with sustainable practices to make a real difference in the world. Nestled on a sprawling, isolated property just outside the city limits, his headquarters stood as a testament to self-reliance and forward thinking. The property itself was an engineering marvel. Rows of towering glass structures housed advanced hydroponic systems where lush greenery thrived under precisely calibrated LED lights. Solar panels lined the roofs, and a state-of-the-art water recycling facility ensured that every drop of water was reused with maximum efficiency. It wasn't just a farm, it was a fortress of innovation, built to operate independently of the city's often unreliable infrastructure. For Ronald, this was his sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the outside world couldn't touch him. But that illusion of control shattered on an otherwise unremarkable Monday morning. Ronald pulled up to the front gate in his dark green pickup truck, coffee steaming in a reusable mug beside him. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the gravel drive. At first glance, everything seemed as it always was. The sleek gate stood tall, the perimeter fencing intact, and the distant hum of machinery from his team already hard at work. But then he saw the vehicles. 3 large white trucks, emblazoned with an official-looking emblem, were parked just inside the property line. Bright orange barricades had been set up around the entrance, and a group of uniformed individuals stood in clusters, some holding clipboards, others pacing purposefully. Ronald frowned, gripping the steering wheel tighter as unease crept into his chest. This wasn't a scheduled inspection, he would have been notified. He pressed the button to roll down his window and leaned out, trying to get a better look. One of the figures, a stocky man in his 40s with a military-style haircut, noticed him and waved a hand in what felt less like a greeting and more like an order. Ronald eased the truck forward until he was directly in front of the gate, but before he could say anything, the man approached with a clipboard. "Morning, sir," the man said briskly, not bothering to introduce himself. "We're here to conduct a compliance inspection on behalf of the local Environmental Oversight Authority. I'm going to need you to park your vehicle outside the perimeter and step out." Ronald blinked. "Compliance inspection? I wasn't notified of any inspection." The man didn't flinch. "Notice was issued through proper channels last week. If you didn't receive it, I suggest you take it up with the office. But for now, this area is restricted while we conduct our work." Ronald's jaw tightened. He didn't appreciate being spoken to like this, especially on his own property. "This is private land," he said, his tone sharpening. "I haven't authorized any inspection, and I certainly didn't grant access to your people." The man's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of impatience in his eyes. "Mr. Myers, your property falls under the jurisdiction of recent regulatory updates concerning agricultural sites. We're within our rights to conduct this inspection. Now, if you don't comply, we'll have to escalate this matter further." Ronald stepped out of the truck, closing the door firmly behind him. He crossed his arms, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the smaller man. "Show me the paperwork," he demanded. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second before handing over the clipboard. Ronald scanned the document, his eyes narrowing as he read the jargon-filled text. The language was deliberately vague, citing newly amended regulations regarding environmental safety and resource management. Nowhere did it explicitly authorize a full inspection of his property. "This doesn't give you the right to shut down my operations or restrict access," Ronald said, holding the clipboard back. "You're overstepping." The man smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "With all due respect, sir, that's not your call to make. Now, if you'll excuse me, we have work to do." He turned and walked away before Ronald could reply. Frustration bubbled in Ronald's chest as he watched the group fan out across his property. One team was unloading equipment from the trucks, while another was already setting up what appeared to be measuring devices near his water recycling tanks. The sheer audacity of their actions left him momentarily stunned. He pulled out his phone and dialed his operations manager, Rachel, who was already on site. "Rachel, what the hell is going on?" he asked as soon as she answered. "I was about to call you," she said, her voice tense. "These people showed up about an hour ago. They're saying we're under inspection for non-compliance with environmental standards. I've been trying to get answers, but they're not giving me much to work with." "Keep an eye on them," Ronald said firmly. "I'll handle this." He ended the call and strode toward the nearest group, his boots crunching against the gravel. His mind raced as he considered his options. These people weren't just inspectors, they were too organized, too confident. This wasn't a routine check, this was an ambush. As he approached the group, a tall woman with a severe expression stepped forward to intercept him. "Mr. Myers, I'm Meredith Cross, the lead supervisor for this inspection. I understand you have concerns, but I assure you everything we're doing here is in accordance with the law." "Law?" Ronald shot back. "You think throwing around legal jargon gives you the right to trespass on my property? I want this shut down immediately." Meredith smiled thinly. "With all due respect, Mr. Myers, that's not how this works. You're welcome to contact your legal counsel, but until then, I suggest you let us do our job." Ronald clenched his fists, the weight of the situation settling heavily on him. This wasn't just about compliance or regulations. Something far more calculated was happening, and he was determined to find out what it was. Ronald spent the next several hours trying to gather his thoughts and make sense of what was happening. After the confrontation at the gate, he had walked the perimeter of his property, keeping a careful eye on the so-called inspectors. They moved with precision, setting up equipment and making notes, as though they had rehearsed every step of this operation. Ronald's employees, confused and uneasy, kept their distance, unsure of how to proceed with their usual tasks, while these outsiders swarmed the site. By the time Ronald reached his office, he had seen enough to know this wasn't just about environmental compliance. The sheer scale of the operation, the trucks, the teams of people, the specialized equipment was far too elaborate for a routine inspection. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Sitting at his desk, he dialed his lawyer, Michael Grant, a no-nonsense attorney who had handled all of GreenCor's legal matters since its inception. The phone barely rang twice before Michael picked up. "Ronald," Michael said, his voice sharp and alert. "I just got your message. What's going on?" "I've got a situation," Ronald replied, leaning back in his chair as he stared out the window at the intruders on his land. "Some environmental oversight team has taken over my property. They're calling it a compliance inspection, but they didn't give me any notice, and their paperwork looks questionable at best." "Did they provide any official documentation?" Michael asked. "They handed me a clipboard with a bunch of legal jargon," Ronald said. "Nothing with a clear signature or proper authorization. It's like they're trying to intimidate me with bureaucratic nonsense." "Send me a copy of whatever they gave you," Michael said. "I'll look into it right away. In the meantime, don't sign anything and don't let them confiscate any equipment or materials. If they try to remove anything from your property, call me immediately." Ronald ended the call and scanned the documents with his phone, sending them over to Michael. Then he sat back, trying to think through his next move. He couldn't just sit and wait for his lawyer to untangle the legal mess every second these people were on his property. They were disrupting his operations and undermining his authority. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Rachel stepped into the office, her expression grim. "Ronald, you need to see this." She handed him a tablet, and Ronald's stomach sank as he looked at the live feed from one of the security cameras near the main greenhouse. Two of the inspectors were dismantling a section of the irrigation system, carefully unscrewing parts and placing them into labeled containers. "What the hell are they doing?" Ronald muttered, his voice low and angry. "They're claiming they need to examine the equipment off-site," Rachel said. "I tried to stop them, but they told me I'd be interfering with an official investigation if I got in the way." Ronald stood abruptly, grabbing his phone and storming out of the office. He marched straight to the greenhouse, his presence immediately drawing the attention of the inspectors. One of them, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, straightened up as Ronald approached. "Mr. Myers," the man said in a measured tone, as though addressing an unruly child, This equipment needs to be tested in a controlled environment to ensure it complies with environmental regulations. You're not taking anything off this property, Ronald snapped. Put it back where you found it, or I'll personally escort you to the gate. The man didn't flinch. Sir, obstructing an environmental investigation is a serious offense. I strongly advise you to cooperate. Ronald stepped closer, towering over the man. This is my property, and that equipment is my intellectual property. You don't have the authority to touch anything without a proper court order. Before the man could respond, Meredith Cross appeared, her calm demeanor as infuriating as ever. Mr. Myers, let's not escalate this unnecessarily, she said. We're simply doing our job, and we have every legal right to conduct this inspection. If you'd like, we can review the regulations together. Spare me the lecture, Ronald said. You're not walking out of here with anything, and if you don't leave my equipment alone, I'll have my security team escort you off the premises. Meredith's smile didn't waver, but there was a hard edge in her eyes. Very well, she said. We'll note your lack of cooperation in our report. But I'd advise you to reconsider. Resistance rarely works out in situations like this. Ronald clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew she was baiting him, trying to push him into making a mistake that could be used against him. Without another word, he turned and walked away, signaling Rachel to follow. Back in the office, Ronald's phone buzzed with a message from Michael. He opened the email and quickly scanned the contents. Ronald, I've reviewed the documents, the message read. The language is intentionally vague. But they're citing a new set of local ordinances that were passed last month. It looks like these ordinances were designed specifically to target properties like yours, large-scale agricultural operations with advanced water systems. I'm digging into the people behind this. But it's going to take time. In the meantime, don't let them take anything off-site and document everything they do. Ronald's frustration deepened as he read the message. This wasn't just a random inspection, it was a coordinated attack. Someone had orchestrated this, using legal loopholes and vague regulations to gain a foothold on his property. Rachel, he said, looking up from his phone, I want you to document every move they make. Get photos, videos, whatever you can. If they so much as breathe on something they're not supposed to, I want it recorded. Rachel nodded. Got it. What's the plan? Ronald took a deep breath, his mind racing. First, we secure our critical systems. Move the backups for the irrigation software to the off-site server, and lock down the control room. Second, I want every employee briefed on what's happening. No one talks to these people without my approval. Rachel hesitated. Do you think they'll come after the data? I don't know, Ronald admitted, but I'm not taking any chances. As the day wore on, the situation grew more tense. The inspectors continued their work, setting up equipment and taking samples without offering any explanations. Ronald's employees grew increasingly uneasy, their usual routines disrupted by the constant presence of strangers. By late afternoon, Ronald received another call from Michael. I've got some preliminary findings, Michael said. The ordinances they're citing were pushed through by a coalition of local officials and a private environmental consulting firm. That firm has ties to a major investment group that's been buying up agricultural land in the area. Ronald's grip on the phone tightened. So this isn't about compliance, it's about forcing me out. Exactly, Michael said. They're using the ordinances as a pretext to make your operations untenable. If they can't shut you down outright, they'll bury you in fines and red tape until you have no choice but to sell. Ronald felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay focused. What are my options? For now, we fight this legally, Michael said. But you need to be prepared for a long battle. These people are playing the long game, and they have resources. Ronald hung up, his mind racing. He had worked too hard to let his company be taken from him. Whatever it took, he was going to fight back, and he wasn't going to fight fair. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the property, Ronald Myers knew he was on borrowed time. The so-called inspectors showed no signs of wrapping up their operations. Instead, their activities had become more invasive. Teams of them were now scattered across key areas of his facility, photographing equipment, recording data, and continuing to dismantle minor components under the pretense of environmental assessment. Ronald paced the length of his office, his mind racing as he tried to strategize. The revelation from his lawyer, Michael Grant, earlier that day that a powerful investment group was likely behind this operation had solidified his suspicions. This wasn't just an inspection, it was an orchestrated attempt to dismantle his business, piece by piece. Whoever was behind this wasn't just after his land or his company, they wanted him out of the way entirely. His thoughts were interrupted by Rachel, his operations manager, who burst into the room, her face tight with frustration. "Ronald, we've got a bigger problem," she said, slamming a tablet onto his desk. "They've started accessing the main water recycling system. They're claiming they need to take samples directly from the filtration tanks. I tried to stop them, but they said refusing access would result in immediate fines." Ronald glanced at the live feed on the tablet, which showed 2 inspectors in hazmat suits standing next to the water tanks. One of them was preparing to drill into the filtration system, while the other scribbled notes onto a clipboard. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered, grabbing his jacket and heading toward the door. "I'm putting an end to this now." Rachel followed closely behind as they made their way across the property. The air was tense, with employees standing in small groups, whispering to one another as they watched the outsiders at work. The usual hum of productivity was gone, replaced by a heavy silence that felt oppressive. When Ronald reached the filtration tanks, he found Meredith Cross waiting for him. She stood with her arms crossed, her sharp suit pristine, despite the dust and grime of the industrial setting. "Mr. Myers," she said smoothly, her tone dripping with feigned politeness, "I trust you're here to cooperate this time." "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ronald demanded, pointing at the man drilling into the tank. "You have no right to tamper with my systems. Shut it down. Now." Meredith raised an eyebrow, as though amused by his outburst. "We're within our rights to collect water samples under the current compliance regulations," she said. "Your filtration system is a critical part of this inspection. If it's found to be non-compliant, we'll have to take further action." Ronald stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "If you damage that system, you're going to be personally responsible for replacing it. And I'll make sure the courts hear about every single violation you've committed today." For a moment, Meredith's mask slipped. Her smile faltered, and a flicker of annoyance crossed her face. But she quickly recovered, gesturing to the technician to pause the drilling. "Very well," she said, her voice icy. "We'll document your refusal to cooperate and include it in our report. But I assure you, Mr. Myers, this won't end well for you." Ronald ignored her, turning to Rachel. "Get security to lock down this area. No one touches these tanks without my express permission." As they walked back toward the main building, Rachel spoke in a low voice. "Ronald, this isn't just about compliance anymore. They're testing you, pushing to see how far they can go." "I know," Ronald replied, "and I'm not going to let them win." Later that evening, as the inspectors packed up their equipment for the day, Ronald gathered his core team in the conference room. The mood was grim, but there was a steely determination in the air. "We're under attack," Ronald began, his voice firm. "This isn't just an inspection, it's a coordinated effort to cripple our operations and force us out. I've spoken with Michael and we have a legal case, but that's not going to be enough. These people have money, connections, and time on their side. We need to be smarter, faster, and tougher than they are." "What's the plan?" one of his senior engineers asked. "First, we secure our systems," Ronald said. "I want all critical data backed up and moved to the off-site server. Lock down access to the control room and disable any external connections they could exploit. Second, we document everything. I want photos, videos, timestamps, anything that shows what they've done here. Rachel, that's your job." Rachel nodded. "Already on it. I've got security footage and logs from today. I'll make sure it's all backed up." "Good," Ronald said. "Now we need to figure out who we're dealing with. Michael mentioned an investment group, someone with a vested interest in taking us down. I want every connection they have to local officials, every name tied to those ordinances, and every company they've targeted before. If we can expose them, we'll have a fighting chance." As the meeting broke up, Ronald felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just defending his business, he was fighting for everything he'd built, everything he believed in. But the next morning brought an even greater escalation. When Ronald arrived at the property, he found that the barricades from the previous day had been replaced with heavy-duty fencing. Signs warning of restricted access were posted every few feet, and a new team of inspectors was already at work. One of them approached Ronald as he exited his truck, handing him an envelope with a red seal. "This is a cease and desist order," the man said curtly. "Effective immediately, all operations on this property are suspended pending further investigation." Ronald ripped open the envelope, scanning the document inside. The order cited vague claims of environmental violations and safety concerns, but it was clear this was just another tactic to force him into submission. "This is bullshit," he said, crumpling the paper in his hand. "I suggest you take it seriously," the man replied. "Failure to comply will result in fines and potential legal action." Ronald clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to lash out. He knew that's exactly what they wanted, for him to lose control and make a mistake they could exploit. Instead, he took a deep breath and turned to Rachel, who had just arrived. "Get Michael on the phone," he said. "I want an emergency injunction filed today, and contact security. No one gets in or out without my approval." As the day wore on, the situation grew more tense. Employees began receiving calls from anonymous numbers, offering them incentives to leave GreenCor and seek other opportunities. Some of the younger staff, already shaken by the presence of the inspectors, started to waver. By late afternoon, Ronald received another piece of news that sent a chill down his spine. One of his engineers discovered that several key pieces of equipment had been tagged with tracking devices, hidden beneath panels and out of sight. "They're watching us," Rachel said, her voice filled with quiet anger. Ronald nodded, his expression hard. "Then it's time we watch them back." That night, Ronald stayed late, reviewing every scrap of information his team had gathered. The evidence was mounting, but so was the pressure. He knew the coming days would push him to his limits. But if they thought they could intimidate him, they were sorely mistaken. This was his land, his company, and his fight, and he wasn't going to lose. Ronald Myers sat in his office, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. It had been 3 days since the so-called inspectors descended on his property, disrupting operations, tagging equipment, and spreading unease among his employees. The once thriving hub of innovation at GreenCor Systems now felt more like a besieged fortress. Every corner of the property was monitored, every move scrutinized, and every action questioned by the outsiders who acted as though they owned the place. The injunction filed by his lawyer, Michael Grant, had bought some time, temporarily halting the inspectors' most aggressive actions. But it hadn't stopped them completely. They continued to linger on the outskirts of the facility, conducting what they called observational assessments and documenting every inch of the land. Meanwhile, the cease and desist order still loomed, preventing Ronald from resuming normal operations. It was a calculated move, just enough pressure to bleed the business dry without crossing the line into overt illegality. As he stared at the latest report from Rachel, his operations manager, Ronald's mind raced with questions. Who were these people? What did they really want? And why had they gone to such lengths to target him specifically? The answers remained maddeningly out of reach, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just about compliance or environmental concerns. This was personal. Rachel entered the room without knocking, her tablet in hand and a determined look on her face. "Ronald, you need to see this," she said, placing the tablet on his desk. The screen displayed a series of photos taken by the security team the night before. At first glance, they seemed innocuous, grainy images of inspectors moving equipment or setting up devices. But Rachel zoomed in on one particular shot, and Ronald's eyes narrowed. The photo showed 2 inspectors standing near the main water recycling tanks. One of them was holding what appeared to be a standard environmental sensor, but the other was crouched low to the ground, adjusting something metallic that blended into the gravel. "What is that?" Ronald asked, leaning closer. "We're not entirely sure," Rachel replied, "but one of the guards found a similar device buried near the western perimeter this morning. It's some kind of transmitter, high frequency, likely used for real-time data collection." Ronald's jaw tightened. "So they're not just inspecting us, they're spying on us." It gets worse, Rachel said, swiping to another image. This one showed a drone hovering over the property, its dark silhouette barely visible against the night sky. We've confirmed at least 2 drones conducting aerial surveys. They're mapping the entire site. A cold knot formed in Ronald's stomach. This wasn't an inspection, it was reconnaissance. Someone was gathering detailed information about GreenCor's layout, infrastructure, and operations. But for what purpose? Before he could dwell on it further, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from Michael. Ronald put the phone on speaker and gestured for Rachel to stay. "Michael," he said, "tell me you've got good news." "Depends on how you define good," Michael replied, his tone clipped. "I've been digging into the ordinances they're using to justify this circus. Turns out they were pushed through by a coalition of local officials and a private consulting firm called Ardent Strategies." "Ardent Strategies," Rachel echoed, frowning. "I've heard that name before." "You should have," Michael said. "They're a front for the Risewell Group, one of the largest investment firms in the state. Risewell has been aggressively acquiring agricultural land over the past 2 years, targeting properties with strategic value, water access, renewable energy systems, you name it." Ronald felt his blood run cold. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place. "So this is about the land," he said. "They're trying to force me out so they can take over." "Exactly," Michael confirmed. "Risewell uses Ardent Strategies to create regulatory pressure on their targets, making it impossible for owners to operate. Once the business is crippled, they swoop in with lowball offers to buy the property. It's efficient, ruthless, and technically legal, at least on paper." "Not this time," Ronald said, his voice like steel. "I'm not selling. I don't care what it takes." "That's the spirit," Michael said. "But you need to be smart about this. I filed a request to review their permits, but it'll take time to go through the courts. In the meantime, document everything. If we can prove they're overstepping their bounds, we'll have a case for damages." After ending the call, Ronald sat in silence for a moment, processing the implications. Risewell wasn't just a competitor, they were a predator, systematically dismantling businesses like his to feed their own empire. And now they had set their sights on GreenCor. But Ronald wasn't about to let them win. That afternoon, he convened a meeting with his senior team. The mood was tense, but Ronald's determination was infectious. "Here's the plan," he began. "First, we're going to secure every critical system on this property. Rachel, I want the E-team to run a full sweep for any additional transmitters or devices. Lock down our servers and encrypt all sensitive data. Second, I want a complete inventory of our equipment. If anything's been tampered with, I want to know about it." Rachel nodded, already taking notes. "What about the drones?" she asked. "I'll handle that," Ronald said. "We've got a few counter-surveillance tools in storage. It's time to put them to use." The next few hours were a blur of activity as Ronald's team mobilized to implement his plan. Meanwhile, Ronald himself focused on the drones. He retrieved a portable signal jammer from the storage shed, a piece of equipment he had acquired years ago but never thought he'd actually need. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ronald stood on the roof of the main building, the signal jammer in hand. Sure enough, the drones returned, their faint hum barely audible over the rustling of the trees. Ronald activated the jammer, watching with grim satisfaction as one of the drones abruptly veered off course and crashed into the nearby woods. It was a small victory, but it gave him a sense of control in a situation that had felt increasingly chaotic. The following day brought an unexpected twist. One of Ronald's engineers, a meticulous man named Elliot, discovered something alarming during a routine inspection of the western greenhouse. Hidden beneath a panel near the foundation was a small, unmarked container. Inside were several documents, blueprints, maps, and what appeared to be a detailed proposal for a new development project. Ronald spread the documents across his desk, his eyes scanning the pages with mounting disbelief. The proposal outlined plans for a high-end residential community, complete with luxury amenities and private access to a water reservoir that would be built on GreenCor's land. The Risewell Group logo was prominently displayed in the corner of each page. "They're already planning the takeover," Rachel said, her voice filled with anger. "They're not just planning it," Ronald replied. "They're counting on it. These bastards think they've already won." But as he stared at the documents, a spark of determination ignited within him. This was more than just a fight for his company, it was a fight for everything he stood for. And if Riswell wanted a war, they were about to get one. The next morning brought an unsettling quiet to the property, as if the storm of the past few days had suddenly paused. But Ronald Myers knew better. The Riswell group and their pawns weren't done, not by a long shot. Their methods were calculated and methodical, and Ronald understood this was merely the eye of the storm. Still, the eerie calm gave him and his team a chance to regroup and prepare for what was coming next. In his office, Ronald pored over the blueprints and development plans discovered in the unmarked container the previous day. The details were chillingly specific. The proposal outlined a timeline for turning GreenCor's property into a sprawling luxury residential enclave, complete with artificial lakes, private gardens, and a community center that would stand where his greenhouses currently operated. It was a vision of utter erasure. Everything Ronald had built would be replaced, scrubbed clean as if it had never existed. "They've already decided we're finished," Ronald muttered to himself. Rachel entered the office without knocking, a grim look on her face. "We've got another problem," she said, setting her tablet on the desk. "One of our employees just quit, Jason, from the engineering team. He said he couldn't handle the pressure." Ronald's brow furrowed. Jason had been with GreenCor for years and was one of their most reliable engineers. Did he say why? Rachel hesitated, then sighed. "He mentioned getting an offer from an unnamed consulting firm. It was too good to pass up. Higher salary, relocation expenses, the works. Sounds like Riswell got to him." Ronald clenched his fists, a surge of anger rushing through him. It wasn't enough for them to attack the company, they were actively picking off his people, sowing doubt and disloyalty among his team. "We can't afford to lose anyone else," he said firmly. "Call a meeting with the staff. I need to address this head-on." An hour later, the employees gathered in the main conference room, their expressions a mix of apprehension and exhaustion. Ronald stood at the front, his hands gripping the edges of the table as he looked around the room. "I know this hasn't been easy," he began. "The past few days have been some of the most challenging we've ever faced as a company. But let me make one thing clear, GreenCor is not going anywhere. These people think they can intimidate us, divide us, and force us out. They think we'll roll over and let them take everything we've worked for. But they're wrong." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I can't promise this will be over soon, and I can't promise it'll be easy. But I can promise you this, we're going to fight back, and if you're willing to stand with me, we'll come out of this stronger than ever." The room was silent for a moment. Then Rachel stepped forward. "I'm with you, Ronald," she said, her voice steady. "We all are." The employees nodded in agreement, and Ronald felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't giving up, not yet. But any sense of relief was short-lived. That evening, a new threat emerged. Ronald was in the control room with Rachel, reviewing security footage when an alert flashed across the monitor. One of the motion detectors near the northern perimeter had been triggered. Ronald clicked on the feed, and his stomach tightened at what he saw. Two figures in dark clothing were moving along the fence line, carrying what looked like bolt cutters. They were careful, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the security cameras as much as possible. But their intent was clear, they were trying to break in. Ronald grabbed his phone and called the head of security, Daniel. "We've got intruders on the north side," he said. "Take a team and intercept them. I want them caught, not scared off." Within minutes, Daniel and 2 guards were on the move. Ronald and Rachel watched the live feed as the security team approached the intruders, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. The figures were focused on cutting through the fence and didn't notice the guards until it was too late. Daniel and his team moved in swiftly, subduing the intruders without a struggle. When the guards brought them back to the main building, Ronald got his first look at them, 2 young men, both in their 20s, dressed in black tactical gear. They refused to answer any questions, remaining silent as the guards searched them. Rachel pulled a phone from one of their pockets and handed it to Ronald. "Let's see who sent them," she said. Ronald unlocked the phone and scrolled through the recent messages. Most of them were cryptic, but one stood out: a set of instructions detailing how to disable the property's water recycling system. The message was signed with a single letter A. "Ardent Strategies," Ronald said, his voice low. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore." The intruders were handed over to the local police, but Ronald knew they wouldn't talk. Whoever sent them would ensure they stayed quiet. Still, the incident was a clear escalation. Risewell wasn't just applying pressure anymore, they were moving towards sabotage. The next morning, Ronald called Michael to update him on the situation. "They're getting desperate," he said. "They sent people onto my property last night to try to disable the water system." Michael sighed. "That's a bold move even for them. Did you get any evidence?" "We caught the intruders and found instructions on their phone," Ronald replied. "But I doubt the police will pursue it. They're too tied up with local politics, and Risewell's reach is too long." "Then we'll have to handle this ourselves," Michael said. "I've got a contact at a federal agency who might be willing to look into this. If we can prove Risewell is engaging in illegal activity, we can shut them down for good." As the call ended, Ronald felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but he finally had a path forward. That afternoon, as Ronald reviewed the latest reports, Rachel entered the office with an envelope in her hand. "This just arrived," she said, her expression uneasy. Ronald opened the envelope and found a single piece of paper inside. It was a message, typed in bold letters: "Sell your land while you still can." The threat was clear, but instead of fear, Ronald felt a surge of defiance. He wasn't going to let them win. "Let them come," he said quietly. "They're going to regret ever starting this." The air was thick with tension as Ronald Myers stood in the dimly lit control room, staring at the map displayed on the monitor. It showed his property and the surrounding area, with every sensor, camera, and checkpoint marked in sharp detail. For days, the assault on his business had escalated: threats, sabotage, and now, a direct attempt to cripple his water recycling system. Ronald knew he was running out of time. Risewell and their proxies weren't going to stop until they had everything. Rachel entered the room, her tablet in hand. "We just got confirmation," she said, her voice tight. "The injunction hearing has been scheduled for tomorrow morning. Michael says it's our best shot at freezing their operations." Ronald nodded, his jaw set. "And the equipment inventory," completed Rachel replied. "We found 3 more tracking devices embedded in the soil sensors near the east greenhouse. Whoever's behind this knows exactly what they're doing." Ronald leaned on the table, his fingers gripping its edge. "It's not enough to defend ourselves anymore. We need to strike back." That night, Ronald and his security team prepared for what felt like a final stand. They reinforced the perimeter, adjusted the cameras to eliminate blind spots, and ran a sweep for any remaining devices. But as the preparations continued, an idea began to take shape in Ronald's mind. "They're mapping us," he said, pacing the control room, "tracking every system, every weak point. But what if we use that against them?" Rachel frowned. "What do you mean?" "We feed them false data," Ronald explained. "If they're relying on these transmitters to monitor our operations, we can manipulate what they see, make them think they've found a critical failure, or even better, a violation severe enough to backfire on them." Rachel's eyes lit up with understanding. "You mean set a trap?" "Exactly," Ronald said. "If we can create the appearance of a catastrophic compliance issue, they'll act on it. And when they do, we'll catch them in the act." Over the next several hours, Ronald's team worked tirelessly to implement the plan. Using the transmitters Risewell had planted, they crafted a data stream that simulated a breach in the property's containment systems. It was a delicate balance, convincing enough to draw attention, but not so obvious that it would appear staged. By midnight, everything was in place. Ronald sat in the control room, watching the monitors as his team monitored the perimeter. The tension was palpable. This plan had to work. Shortly after 2 a.m., the first alert came. A vehicle had stopped near the southern perimeter, just outside the range of the security cameras. Moments later, 3 figures emerged from the shadows, their movements swift and practiced. "They're here," Rachel said, her voice low but steady. Ronald watched as the intruders made their way toward the east greenhouse, the same area the false data had highlighted as compromised. They carried tools and small devices, clearly prepared for sabotage. "Let them get to the target," Ronald instructed. "We need to catch them red-handed." The intruders reached the greenhouse and began working quickly, dismantling parts of the structure and planting what appeared to be small charges. Ronald's stomach churned at the sight. These weren't just saboteurs, they were setting the stage for a disaster that would justify a full shutdown of GreenCor's operations. Once they were fully engaged, Ronald gave the signal. Within seconds, the security team moved in, surrounding the intruders with practiced precision. Flashlights illuminated the scene, and the men froze, their hands raised as armed guards closed in. "Don't move, Daniel," the head of security ordered. The intruders were disarmed and restrained, but it wasn't until their equipment was searched that the full scope of the operation became clear. Among their tools were devices designed to simulate chemical leaks and soil contamination, enough to fabricate evidence of environmental violations severe enough to destroy Ronald's company. "Call the police," Ronald said, his voice cold, "and make sure Michael gets copies of everything we found." By the time the authorities arrived, the evidence was overwhelming. The intruders refused to speak, but their equipment told the story clearly enough. Ronald handed over the data from the tracking devices, the footage from the night's events, and the fake development plans they'd left behind during their earlier intrusion. The next morning, Ronald and Michael arrived at the courthouse, armed with enough evidence to turn the tables on Risewell. The hearing was tense, with Risewell's representatives arguing that the compliance measures were necessary for public safety. But when Michael presented the footage and documentation, their defense began to crumble. "They fabricated violations, planted devices, and sent agents onto my client's property to sabotage his operations," Michael said, his voice cutting through the courtroom. "This isn't about compliance or environmental safety. This is about greed." The judge reviewed the evidence with a furrowed brow before turning to Risewell's attorney. "Do you have an explanation for this?" The attorney stammered, clearly caught off guard. We were following standard procedures." "Standard procedures don't include sabotage and planting false evidence," the judge interrupted. "This case warrants further investigation." By the end of the hearing, Ronald had secured not just an injunction against Risewell's activities, but also an order for an independent investigation into their practices. It was a decisive blow, one that shifted the momentum firmly in his favor. As he left the courthouse, Ronald felt the weight of the past week begin to lift. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time he had the upper hand. Risewell had underestimated him, and now they were paying the price. "This isn't just about winning," he said to Michael as they walked to the car. "It's about making sure they can't do this to anyone else." Michael nodded. "And that's exactly what we'll do." The days following the hearing were a whirlwind of activity. Ronald Myers had won a critical battle, but the war wasn't over. The injunction against Risewell meant the immediate pressure on GreenCor had eased, and the independent investigation into their practices had sent shockwaves through their carefully constructed facade. Still, Ronald knew they wouldn't retreat quietly. Corporations like Risewell didn't admit defeat. They adapted, regrouped, and struck back harder. Back at GreenCor, the atmosphere was cautious but hopeful. Employees who had been on edge for weeks now walked the grounds with a renewed sense of purpose. The constant presence of saboteurs and inspectors had lifted, and operations were beginning to return to normal. Yet the scars of the conflict were still visible. Dismantled equipment, reinforced fences, and tightened security measures were stark reminders of the battle they had fought. Ronald gathered his senior team in the conference room for a final debrief. "We've taken the first step," he began, his tone resolute. "The injunction gives us room to breathe, and the investigation into Risewell will expose their methods. But make no mistake, this isn't over. We need to stay vigilant." Rachel, seated to his right, nodded. "We've implemented a comprehensive security protocol. Every system is being monitored in real time, and all employees are undergoing additional training on how to handle potential threats." "Good," Ronald said. "But we can't just play defense. If we want to protect GreenCor long-term, we need to take the fight to them." The team discussed plans to expand GreenCor's influence and partnerships. By aligning with other independent agricultural companies and environmental organizations, they could create a network strong enough to resist corporate predators like Risewell. It wasn't just about protecting GreenCor anymore, it was about setting an example and helping others stand up to similar threats. 2 weeks later, the investigation into Risewell yielded its first major breakthrough. Federal agents raided Ardent Strategies' offices, uncovering a trove of documents that detailed their coordinated efforts to destabilize targeted businesses. The plans for GreenCor's takeover were just the tip of the iceberg. Dozens of other companies had been similarly attacked, their land and resources siphoned off under the guise of regulatory enforcement. The news spread quickly, tarnishing Risewell's reputation and triggering lawsuits from affected business owners. For Ronald, it was a moment of vindication. Watching the public backlash unfold, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Risewell had finally been exposed for what they were: predators who hid behind bureaucracy and influence. But the victory wasn't just about taking down Risewell. It was about what came next. 1 month after the hearing, GreenCor hosted an open house event, inviting local officials, business leaders, and community members to tour the facility. Ronald stood near the entrance, greeting visitors and explaining GreenCor's mission. The event was a success, showcasing not just the company's innovations but also its resilience. As the day wound down, Rachel approached Ronald with a small plaque in her hands. She handed it to him with a smile. "I thought this would be a good addition to the property," she said. Ronald turned the plaque over. Reading the engraved words, here stood a company that refused to yield. He smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "It's perfect," he said, motioning for her to help him mount it near the main greenhouse. As he stood there, watching the late afternoon sun cast its golden glow over the property, Ronald reflected on how far they'd come. GreenCor wasn't just a business, it was a testament to the power of standing firm against impossible odds. The fight with Risewell had cost him dearly: time, resources, and peace of mind, but it had also strengthened his resolve and revealed the depths of his team's loyalty and determination. For the first time in weeks, Ronald allowed himself to relax. The battle was over, but the lessons it had taught him would endure. GreenCor was stronger than ever, and so was he. As the last of the guests departed, Ronald walked the property alone, taking in the sights and sounds of his land. The hum of the irrigation systems, the glow of the greenhouses, the distant chatter of his employees, it was a symphony of resilience and hope. And though he knew challenges would come again, he was ready for them. After all, this was his land, his legacy, and his fight. And Ronald Myers was a man who never backed down.